Bridgeland, who's CEO of Civic Enterprises, a public policy firm in Washington, D.C., served under both the Bush and Obama administrations, has written a new book called Heart of the Nation, Volunteering and America's Civic Spirit. John, welcome to the program.
Ed and Tim, nice to be with you.
What about it, John? Tim Tebow, what's going to happen next?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think you mentioned Tim Tebow. You know, there's a man driven by his faith who, you know, during the off season does so much in charitable work for young kids with diseases, and you know, the first thing he said when he was traded to New York was, I'm gonna bring that same charitable spirit to the people of New York. So he's actually a good example of what we're talking about today.
Yeah, you're a good segue, by the way. I was trying to throw you off there, but man, you stayed right on message, brother.
Turned it right along. Made the publisher happy.
That's right. Not going to rabbit trail there for 5 minutes when I can be talking about something in the book. The book is called Heart of the Nation, and it's written by our guest, John Bridgeland. It's subtitled Volunteering and America's Civic Spirit, published by Roman and Littlefield and available in bookstores everywhere. And in just a few minutes, we'll let you, John, tell you where else you can get a copy of his book, Heart of the Nation. What? By the way, just tell our listeners just a minute what your day job is, and then tell us why you decided to write this particular book.
Sure. So my day job is I founded a company called Civic Enterprises that brings together people who care about issues like the high school dropout epidemic and education reform, or ending malaria deaths in Africa, or working to help boost economic opportunities for those who don't have jobs, and looking at the creative ways in which we can work with local communities and states and others to bring a little more hope to our country. I wrote the book because I was director of the White House Domestic Policy Council on 9/11, and my job went from coordinating domestic policy to finding myself in a bunker below the White House looking at the extraordinary events that were unfolding. But at the same time, Tim and Ed, literally thousands of Americans were calling the White House, lighting up the phones to ask what they could do to help their country. And President Bush created an initiative to help strengthen and tap America's spirit of charity and volunteering and national community service to help address our toughest challenges, and also to give people an outlet to contribute in a time of national disaster.
John, it seems to me, if I remember my history right, that the Founding Fathers believed in, of course, there was the governmental apparatus, but that they really seem to believe in the civic life of America and these kinds of informal associations or even formal associations amongst the citizenry, that they would handle the bulk of American social life, that it wasn't all thrown on the shoulders, in their mind, it wasn't proper to throw it all on the shoulders of government, that the civic life was going to be key. And by formal and informal associations, formal might be like your church. Informal might just be a group of people who decide to get together to put new sod on the baseball fields for the kids so they can play ball. Am I right in that? Is that the vision of the Founding Fathers?
It sure is. Your history is right on point. And the founders were throwing off a tyrannical government when they wrote the Declaration of Independence and constituted a new government, but it was expressly founded on the rights of the people. And you're right that they wanted, first to look to individual citizens, faith-based institutions, what they called the little platoons of civil society, to solve problems first. In fact, George Washington said, when we assumed the soldier to fight in the Revolution, we didn't lay aside the citizen. And Madison and Washington envisioned a national university, actually, that has become American University and George Washington University, that actually train generations of Americans on what it meant to be a good citizen in your local community, tackling tough problems. So you're exactly right, and every president since Washington has tried to summon in some way and kind of ignite that remind Americans, as Bush said, we need to be citizens, not spectators. And we need to resurrect that spirit today, especially at a time when the country feels like it can't solve its toughest challenges.
Talking to John Bridgeland, author of the book Heart of the Nation, Volunteering and America's Civic Spirit. Did you look at volunteerism in history prior to the United States?
Sure. We actually looked at systems all across the world and how they have tried to ignite civic engagement in civil society. But what I think is it's actually unique in America that we would found constitutional government based on the premise that individual citizens hold power, elect people who represent them, and then basically we first look to those individuals and institutions first to address America's problems. One thing we did also after 9/11 was to look at what's the role of faith-based institutions, and we discovered that more than a fourth of all social services in the United States, helping the poor and the needy and the hungry and the homeless, and really, was on the backs of faith-based institutions. So the president took their side, and we all worked to strengthen the role of faith-based institutions in helping serve the poor and needy.
You talking about President Bush's 1,000 Points of Light?
No, that was President George H.W. Bush who did 1,000 Points of Light to honor those traditional volunteers who, would serve in their local communities and do extraordinary things. And President Bush 43 created something called the Freedom Corps that strengthened the role of community and faith-based institutions, and also provided more Americans more opportunities to serve, including actually in preparation and response to disasters of all kinds.
Talking to John Bridgeland. Heart of the Nation, Volunteering and America's Civic Spirit is a great book, great read, and helps you appreciate the history and the importance of volunteering and America's civic spirit. That's hard to say together, by the way.
You did fine.
Yeah. I want to ask you about that, because you mentioned that 25% or a quarter of the groups in this country who help the poor and needy are faith-based, and a vast majority of them obviously would be Christian, either Catholic or Protestant. Mm-hmm. But I would suspect that most of the rest of them, the groups that are secular maybe, even those are inspired by the Judeo-Christian heritage, the value system.
Absolutely right.
Oh, you're on to what I'm saying. I didn't know where you are on this one, because I don't want to draw you into some philosophical conversation you don't want to have. But I mean, that's my observation. Go ahead.
In fact, when I was in the Oval Office briefing President Bush, he said, "Bridge, how are we going to know whether volunteering in America increases or declines?" And I said, "That's interesting, Mr. President. We need to create, a volunteering survey in the United States." So we did, and we measured it annually. And what we discovered was that the year after 9/11, there was a huge spike in volunteering that continued through the end of 2005. So America not only, responded in droves in terms of serving community and country, but they did so for half a decade, which is really extraordinary. And what was also interesting was that the vast majority of Americans who were volunteering were serving through faith-based or religious institutions. And I think you're right that even if they weren't formally serving through faith-based institutions, which most of them were, that was the leading institution through which Americans were serving. So many Americans are driven by their the Beatitudes and their religious beliefs, and wanting to help their neighbor in their country.
America, and I would guess Americans, but America has always been very individualistic in terms of its ideology. You can succeed, you can go on. The traditional view, is you work hard and you can succeed. But what I hear you saying is that maybe despite that kind of individualistic view, Americans are still always willing to volunteer. Now, how do and people don't go about trying to necessarily make these kind of things dovetail, but your observations philosophically, how do Americans? Is it because we're so blessed and we think we should reach out and share with others less fortunate? How do they kind of meld those two
That's
impulses?
a wonderful question, and it's so interesting because you're right. Fundamental to the American dream is that if you work hard and play by the rules in the United States, you could advance as far as your talents and energies take you. But when Jefferson penned this notion of the pursuit of happiness, he wasn't just talking about the individual pursuing his or her own happiness. They were also talking about helping one another to achieve that happiness. And in turn, citizens and individuals and faith-based institutions and community groups working all across the country to help strengthen the country and help address our toughest challenges, which people can't do in isolation. They have to work together to solve those challenges, whether it's, today the almost 1 million people who drop out from high school are returning veterans who are coming back to this country and have high rates of poverty and homelessness and unemployment, and the millions of young children who are, go hungry every year. Those are problems that it takes sort of all of us to work together to solve.
John, do you have a website?
We do. It's for the book. It's heartofthenation.us.
Heartofthenation.us?
Yes.
Heartofthenation.us. One of the things, and this is, front and center, what you're talking about here today, is you think about America and the uniqueness of our spirit, if you will, which is linked to what a lot of us still like to call American exceptionalism, which is not in any way to be construed as arrogant, as some people try to link the terms exceptionalism, i.e. you think you're superior to everybody. Right. No, we don't think we're superior to everybody, but our way of life and our value system, yes, it's superior.
Yeah, we believe that.
Yes, and or else we wouldn't subscribe to it and try to live by it and try to promote it around the world. Freedom, liberty, caring for others, values, those kinds of things. But those things have served us so well for so long. On a local level, the volunteerism that people do in their communities, is that still present? Because, John, the reason I ask that is we've hit the 70s forward. The me generation. Ed mentioned. I'm sort of linking my question what Ed asked earlier.
Yeah.
People are on. They care about. We care about ourselves. We want ours. We don't have time for that kind of stuff. So are we at risk of losing our volunteer spirit?
That's a wonderful question, too. The greatest generation coming out of World War II volunteered more, voted more, gave more in charitable contributions. And, you worry coming out of the baby boomers, and I'm a baby boomer. It's interesting. We did a survey of boomers, 78 million Americans who were, in the boomer generation. And they worry now, as they've gotten older, that they have been the me generation and that they're leaving the world in worse condition, that they inherited it. And interestingly, they want to give back now and make it right. What's also encouraging is this new millennial generation. These are the young people 18 to about 30, and their attitudes toward volunteering and giving back and wanting to solve problems is reminiscent of what we saw in the greatest generation. So those things give me hope that we can resurrect that wonderful American tradition.
John, let me ask you this in terms of our founding fathers, because it looks like what we have developed over the last. I don't know. Historically, I couldn't put, but at least in my lifetime, I was born in 1958, so I'm 54 years old. But it seems like we've developed an idea that we should be served in Washington by professional politicians, that the people go to Washington and their desire is to stay there their entire lives or until they're old enough to retire or want to retire. Did the Founding Fathers see that as what they were wanting to create, a professional political class, or this idea of volunteering was going to Washington or wherever our capital happened to be. Was that seen as simply a way to serve your fellow citizen and that for a while and then you go home?
Yeah, good for you. I couldn't agree with you more. I think we have too much professionalism in political life today, and the founders worried a lot about parties. Their biggest concern was tyranny, and so they built a machinery of government